All right, when we left off, we had just started talking about life in New England, and probably one of the more historic and maybe infamous moments will become the Salem witch trials. There's a couple of things that we'll take from this about kind of mass hysteria, and it's going to be some changes to the church. All right, it's not necessarily going to be all about witches, obviously, but there's just, I'll explain it as we go. First thing, says the halfway covenant in the Salem witch trials in 1662, ministers announced a new kind of formula for church. And they created what, and covenant means pact with God. They created this halfway pact with God. And what they were realizing is their strict policy on church attendance and how long church was taking place. And if you weren't doing that, then you're kicked out of the colony. That wasn't super conducive to attracting new people coming into the colony. Okay? So they created a halfway covenant, meaning you could be a halfway church member. You could go to church most of the time. Maybe you wouldn't have to stay for all of the time. Does that make sense? What they're doing is they're starting to loosen up the, I would say, guidelines for being a church member. And as you might imagine, this move increased the church's memberships. That's huge, right? Because how does a church get money? They collect it, right, from their parishioners. I mean, that's how they get money. That's how they've always gotten money. And if you don't have big attendance, you're not going to have enough money to run your church. So this helps boost and aid in the money-stricken church. Okay? It increased membership, therefore increased revenue. With increased revenue, the church again has a significant amount of power. I wouldn't say it didn't before that, but it was dwindling, and they could see it. And they want to restore that. They want to restore their membership. So they loosen up the guidelines for coming in. All right, then a group of adolescent girls in Salem, Massachusetts claimed to have been bewitched by a certain older woman. A witch hunt ensued, leading to the legal lynching of 20 women in 1692. There's a pretty lengthy story to it. I won't get into all of it, but essentially, some of these girls had contact with a lady who had practiced parts of the voodoo religion, and long story short, they got themselves in trouble, and instead of kind of fessing up for them not doing what they were supposed to do, they pretended to be bewitched or entranced. And the details of it are certainly interesting, and I did post a video if you want to watch it. I actually think it got shut down, but if you really want to watch it, you can YouTube, History Channel, Salem Witch Trials. And we'll get into all of the details about how they went about this and how they were supposedly bewitched. But the big picture thing for us to look at is the hysteria that it creates. Because what ends up happening is when people thought somebody else was different, then they accused them of being a witch. And in this case, that cost them their lives, potentially, because they had to go on trial and prove that they weren't. Now, whereas today, if you are arrested, you are what? Are you presumed guilty or innocent? Innocent. They have to prove you're guilty. When it's the other way around, that's pretty challenging. I mean, how do you prove you're not bewitched? And they had all kinds of very bizarre, and again, that History Channel video does a pretty good job. Some people have considered it sexual exploitation, where they said there was a mark of a witch, and it's, in a private area, and there was all kinds of things that these clergy were doing, and they're the ones that are kind of responsible for trying to determine whether somebody was a witch or not. And, the girls kind of played it up a little bit too, and ultimately, this hysteria ensues. I'm going to show you advertisement for a witch hunter, somebody who claimed they could find a witch. Some people used it for gain. They might, maybe not like somebody, or maybe it was a widow or widower, I should say, and they had some land. Maybe they wanted that land. Now you accuse them of being a witch, and they're killed, and then that land goes to the church. And if it goes to the church, you can buy it from the church. So there was a lot of, side things, I guess you could say, that are going on with this. It's not just, as far as we're concerned, as studying history, the witch part of the witch trial doesn't matter that much. The hysteria that is caused by it, how people used it, how people believed it, we're going to see this time and again in American history, much later on too. In the 1950s, it was the Red Scare. Senator Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin was accusing people of being communists, and people thought that communists had infiltrated, everywhere in our society. And then it became, again, if you don't like that person or that person's different than you, they're probably a communist. And it cost people their jobs, not their lives necessarily, but it cost people their jobs and their livelihood, that mass hysteria concept. You could say the same thing happens after 9/11, right? We know that the terrorists who committed the attacks on 9/11 were Muslim. Was there Muslim hysteria after that? Were people nervous if they saw somebody with a hijab or, they were? It's, again, that concept. It's not unique to that time. In 1693, the witchcraft hysteria had ended when the governor of Massachusetts prohibited any further trials. He was smart enough to say, hold on a minute. This isn't right. And so they stopped it. And in 1711, the Massachusetts legislature annulled all the convictions. So all of the witches were no longer considered to be witches. The problem is 20 of them are dead. So the government said, we're sorry. We know you weren't a witch, but that really doesn't do anything except for some reparation to their heirs. Okay, land restored back to descendants type thing. So kind of an interesting situation. And again, like I said, if you want to watch the video, if it's something that interests you, it does get into a lot more details of how it all unfolded. But it's a mass hysteria type situation. This is just, I want to kind of get to this one actually. So this is the one I wanted to show you.
Can I have your attention, please? Any juniors with the last name H through M should go to the West lecture at this time if you need a retake. Thank you.
So this guy is advertising himself as a witch finder general. So he's heading out to look for witches. Like, they're playing up on the hysteria too, right? Because he could just accuse anybody of being a witch because nobody really was a witch. So it was really dependent upon him, and he would, charge a fee, and he'd go out and find witches for you. All right, the New England way of life. There is less diversity in New England than there is in the South. There's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, the soil's not great. And number two, it's hot in the summer and cold in the winter. And the South has what we would consider a little bit more stable climate. Obviously, you get way down south, and it's a little bit hotter. But for the most part, the climate is a little bit more stable. It doesn't get quite so cold in the winter. If you're close to the ocean, it doesn't always get that hot. Native Americans recognized the right to use land, but they had no concept of owning. Okay, we talked about that before. That's why there's conflict that takes place in New England. All right, and in other places as well, but it's starting in New England a little bit quicker. People of New England became experts at shipbuilding and commerce due to the timber found in the dense forest, and they often fished for cod. Okay, so shipping, this is going to be the big part. Shipping and trade and fishing are all big parts of their economy. Still is today, right? You watch the Discovery Channel, you'll see all kinds of shows about fishing in Alaska, which obviously we're not talking about now, or in the New England region. Okay? Shipping is still a very big part of their way of life. Combination of Calvinism, soil, and climate in New England made for energy, purposefulness, sternness, stubbornness, self-reliance, and resource. I don't know about that statement so much, but it's not like everybody was that way. But typically what we found out is people were pretty industrious in order to survive in that climate. And one of the things early on, doctors used to prescribe people who, I would say, got sick often in the South. They would tell them to move to a place that has 4 seasons, 4 distinct seasons. And that was considered to be healthier for you. And part of it is because when it gets really cold outside, it doesn't make you susceptible to catching a cold, right? Why do we get more colds when it's cold outside? Anybody know? Because we spend more time indoors. They didn't. When it got cold outside, they still had to work outside, right? And they're not packed into, like we are, much more densely populated. And so it was actually pretty good for people who were suffering from illnesses in the South to head to the North and be in a time where there is no disease-carrying mosquitoes, right? It's too cold out. Does that make sense? Like, it was considered to be good for your system to have the 4 distinct seasons. And so that's what they're really talking about here when it says the energy. And certainly you have to be industrious to survive in that type of climate as well. All right, early settlers, days and ways. Women, slave or free, on southern plantations or northern farms, wove, cooked, cleaned, cared for children. All right, typical gender role for a female. Men cleared land, fenced, planted, cropped the land, cut firewood, butchered livestock as needed. We'll see these gender roles change at different times in history and then almost revert back. We'll see a big influx of women getting into the workforce during World War I. And then, post-World War I, when we have the flapper era, newfound independence for women, and then World War II hits, Great Depression, and then World War II, and all of a sudden the 50s, gender roles become super specific again, and women end up back, in the home. And we'll actually do a comparison. We take a look at a 1950s sitcom and a sitcom from 2020, and how much it tells us about society. And you'll see the gender roles very specifically. When you look at the entertainment that people watch, it often portrays, what life is like, and they'll try to make fun of it. It's kind of interesting. All right, resentment against the upper class. We talked about Bacon's Rebellion, and we said really the gist of the problem with Bacon's Rebellion is it was poor people not feeling like they were being accurately helped or represented by the wealthy. They wanted protection from the Native Americans. The governor didn't want to give it to them. He had a trade agreement with them, so he wasn't too interested in it. And we're going to see something like this happen as well in other places. Uprising of Maryland's Protestants toward the end of the 17th century. The old Leisler's Rebellion.
Good morning, Monticello High School, and please pardon the interruption. This is a quick announcement from the activities office here today. We will have 3 home football games this fall, starting with Sauk Rapids on Friday at 7 o'clock. Our varsity players will be given 2 tickets each to give to family members or friends. That leaves approximately 50 tickets for our home games. These tickets will be available for our senior class only this fall. Underclassmen will be able to attend next year. Seniors who are interested in purchasing a ticket for $5 can sign up in the activities office starting today. You may also sign up with a friend, but your name can only be signed up one time. We'll draw the 50 students Wednesday afternoon, and you must pay by Thursday afternoon to get your ticket. Seniors who are not drawn this week will have an opportunity for one of the 2 remaining games. Students and fans without a ticket cannot be on campus during the game. There is no tailgating and no concessions this fall. We're glad to be back playing, even if it's with only 250 fans. Have a great day, and go Magic.
Technically speaking, it's not 250 fans. 100 are coming from Sauk Rapids Rice. I don't think they'll be cheering for us. Well, we can ask them to. see what they say. All right, so point here is we're seeing tension exist in the colonies between the rich and the poor, and we're really going to see breakdown, I think, in part of chapter 5, where there is a very small percentage of the population that's controlling about 2/3 of the wealth. Okay, so this is going to have to get fleshed out a little bit, and at this stage of the game, when that's happening, they are rebellions, they're insurgencies, and they are pretty bloody from time to time. And this, although kind of chronologically out of order, just kind of puts things in perspective. In 1651, Massachusetts prohibited poorer folk from wearing gold or silver lace. We're not talking about wearing gold or silver, just the color you weren't allowed to wear if you weren't wealthy enough. And that's really people's attitudes. These rebellions are going to start to break that attitude down. And again, when we're talking about big picture, like why do we look at these things? How does it impact us today? We're looking at the beginning of trying to create equality in this country. And this time it's economic equality. All right, and we could certainly argue whether or not that exists, but there is an attempt that's made to put people on equal footing. All right? Having the right to vote based on age as opposed to qualifiers like land ownership or things like that ultimately means that people are supposed to be on an equal footing. They have just as much political power. Does that make sense? I mean, whether or not it truly works that way, we could argue certainly, but this is what's happening. Just some paintings kind of representative of the time. There's our chronology. And now we're going to shift over to chapter 5. Colonial society on the eve of revolution, 1700 to 1775. To be honest with you, we're not going to talk a whole lot about pre-revolutionary activities necessarily. Just going to talk about the way life was happening. All right, it says over the course of the 1700s, the population in North American colonies exploded. This is kind of interesting. I didn't underline it because I'm not going to ask you that again, but I always think it's interesting. Britain no longer had more people than its colonies, and had more is not one word. That's a typo. Nice job, Red, underlining. You should have told me that was a typo. Colonies had more population. It's exploding. All right, tons of people are coming here. They're not all coming from England, but once they come to these colonies, they are technically English. Does that make sense? So their population is growing very rapidly, and the people here are expanding rapidly. In 1775, the most populous colonies were Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Maryland. About 90%, and I did underline this because this is something we're going to track throughout American history, about 90% of people lived in rural areas. The majority of Americans will live in rural areas until just after or just before World War I. That's about the time that it switches. Today, the majority of Americans live in urban areas. And that's important because that switch signifies when we go from being an agrarian society, in other words, a society that the vast majority, or I shouldn't say vast, the majority of people make their living off farming as opposed to, manufacturing or other things. There certainly is a great deal of farming in this country. It's just controlled by a lot fewer people. If that makes sense. There aren't a lot of family farms, like little farms. They're pretty big in order to make money. All right, here's some of the population breakdowns. I just put, Germans 6%, Scots-Irish 7%. That's a bigger group. that's not English, but still obviously not as many as there are English. Mid-18th century, a series of Scot-Irish settlements were scattered along what's known as the Great Wagon Road, which hugged the eastern Appalachian foothills from Pennsylvania to Georgia. This is that frontier land, and oftentimes they would encounter the Native Americans. There was conflict there. They bore the brunt of it. I think I told you before, neither side was real nice to one another. The Scots-Irish are going to lead an armed march of what they call the Paxton Boys in Philadelphia in 1764. And they were protesting the fact that the Quakers were lenient towards the Native Americans. So we talked about Pennsylvania being very open and lenient towards Native Americans because of the Quakers. And the Quakers are essentially starting to lose political power. As the population is growing, Quakers are starting to slowly become outnumbered. And as that's happening, the leniency towards Native Americans is decreasing. Does that make sense? So what was once a haven for all is starting to kind of shift away from that as the population is changing. A few years later, they led the Regulator movement in North Carolina, small but nasty insurrection against the Eastern dominated of the colony's affairs. And again, they don't think they're being fairly represented.
Can I have your attention, please? All students in grade 11 with the last name N through Z should go to the West Lecture at this time if they need to have their photo taken. Thank you.
And they're fighting back because of it. It's going to be a real test when this country is formed as to how to deal with unhappy people. Because unhappy people didn't protest back then by holding signs. They protested by grabbing guns. And the first time that we see truly a flaw in the Articles of Confederation is when we encounter that type of situation. And then when we switch to the Constitution, we will see that situation again, and it is immediately stopped. And it's considered to be kind of the thing that's the, I don't know, linchpin. Like it showed the Constitution could work. But it's interesting because George Washington, because the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, literally got on his horse and led the federal troops to go fight the insurrection. And when they heard Washington was coming, they all just quit. They're like, nope, we don't want that. I mean, can you imagine if a sitting president today hopped in a tank and said, let's go? I mean, I don't care who it is, Trump, Biden, Obama, whatever. I don't see that happening anytime soon. Well, that's how it happened back then. This is a breakdown of some of the different ethnicities that we'll see. It's not real good. I mean, it's hard for you to kind of see the map, but we'll get into that a little bit more as we start to talk about the differing sides when we get to the Revolutionary War. You can still see the majority are still English, okay? And then these are the other groups that break down. Who's coming here? By the mid-1700s, the richest 10% of Bostonians and Philadelphians owned 2/3 of the taxable wealth in their cities, okay? This is what I talked about just a little bit earlier. That's a significant disparity in where the money is. And so all of this stuff is going to lead us to attempting to try to fix that. A lot of times when we see the all men are created equal, we assume they're talking about race. But what's the real conflict that early colonists see? It's not race, it's what? It's money, right? The difference between the rich and the poor. How are the poor treated? How are the rich treated? So when they're talking about all men are created equal, they're not really thinking about race yet. Keep in mind, some of the people who wrote that had slaves. They're talking about economic differences. 1750, Boston contained a large number of homeless poor who were then forced to wear a large red P on their clothing. Not give them a place to stay, but instead put a large P on their clothing, just in case you weren't sure who they were. In all the colonies, the influx of indentured servants added to the population of the lower classes. We know that that decreases. Black slaves are still the lowest class in society. We're pretty aware of that too. This is again African Americans being sold, slave auction. One of the things I kept this on here because it just talks about that they don't have smallpox. And I think we said that before, which is again one of the benefits of having slavery from Africa, is that they had been exposed to smallpox before, so they knew that they had immunities to it. This is how we know that they're very well aware of how smallpox is transferred now, that you can give it to other people. All right, you can't really see this, but this is actually underlined. Okay. Position in the Christian ministry held the highest prestige. Okay. The most important person in town is the priest, pastor, whatever. Okay, the head of the church. Physicians, not so much. Kind of 50-50. And there's a really logical reason why. One, they're fairly poorly trained, but I'm sure they're trying hard. Two, this is a time period where you didn't go to the doctor until there was like no other option. And so oftentimes when people went to the doctor, what is the outcome? Cured, healed, or dead? The answer is dead, right? Because they were probably wasn't medicine available to actually cure them at the time. And most likely they had waited till the very last minute because, again, you attempted to fix things at home by yourself. I mean, there were home remedies for everything. And I'm sure many of those worked. And so when you got to the stage where you actually had to go to the doctor, it was pretty much so like saying goodbye. It's just different than it is in today's society. You have symptoms now, you go to the doctor right away, you get something that can help you. Then you try something at home until you ran out of answers. Then you went to the doctor.
Please, all students in grade 10 with the last name A through G should go to the West lecture at this time for a photo if they need to. Thank you.
I thought this was kind of interesting. Epidemics are a constant nightmare. Everybody fears it. Considering we're living in a pandemic, I thought it was kind of interesting. Crude form of inoculation was introduced in 1721. Powdered dried toad was a favorite prescription for smallpox. That does nothing. There is times, and people started to believe this, that number one, you just eat the worst tasting things you can, it's probably medicine. That's not real good either. Diphtheria was a killer, especially for young people. Lawyers are not held in high regard, mostly because they're not necessarily, lawyers today defend people. Back then, I think lawyers were used more for legal claims as far as land and property. And typically, if someone had a lawyer, they were probably taking something of yours. That makes sense? All right, agriculture is a leading industry involving about 90% of the people. That makes sense, right? Because what percentage of people lived in rural areas? 90%, okay? So 90% are involved in agriculture. Okay? We are an agrarian society. The vast majority of our money is made off of agriculture. It's going to be that way for a while. Fishing isn't nearly as prevalent as agriculture, but it was financially rewarding. And again, it kind of depends upon where you live. Trade is very popular in New England group, New York and Pennsylvania. Triangular trade is something that we talk about in history all the time. I did underline it though, because it's important. You just have to remember how it works. Ship would leave New England port with rum, sail to Africa, pick up slaves, sail to the West Indies, pick up molasses to take this to New England, where it'd be converted to rum again. Manufacturing in the colonies was of only secondary importance, and part of that is because of an economic system known as mercantilism, in which, natural resources that are harvested in the colonies are typically sent over to England to be produced into something else, with the exception of shipbuilding, which was pretty big here. Lumbering was the most important manufacturing activity. By 1770, about 1/3 of the British ships in the merchant marine were built in the Americas. Like I said, shipbuilding was pretty big here because of the lumber that we have. And we'll see here coming up, I don't know if we'll get to it today, but because of mercantilism, and you understand why mercantilism is the way it is. In order for the British to make money off the colonists, because they don't really tax them, at least not right away, they make it so that resources that are harvested here or taken here are sent to England, to English manufacturers, where they can then build something and then sell it. And so it makes it so there isn't demand or open market for the resources. So the resources stay cheap for the British or English manufacturers, and then they can sell it and turn a profit. And then, England is taxing those manufacturers. Does that make sense? Like, they're still getting money that way. That's how mercantilism worked. That's exactly how the British used it until after the French and Indian War, in which they said, well, it's ridiculous that the colonists aren't paying taxes, because we spent a whole bunch of money, like $100 million in that time period's money, to defend the colonies, so they should pay for it. Then the colonists got pretty upset, said, no taxation without representation. Let's just make sure we get this right here. As early as 1730s, fast breeding Americans, that's an interesting way to put it, demanded more and more British products, yet the slow-growing British population early reached the saturation point for absorbing imports from America. So that's what I'm talking about, right? In mercantilism. We're sending stuff over there. They're supposed to make something with it. We could then buy it back, but we can't get it fast enough. Like, a population is growing so fast, the demand for the products is exceeding what the supply is. And so the colonists, which they're not supposed to do, start to look to other countries. Who else can provide it? And at first, the British don't really do anything about it, because honestly, they're making money hand over fist, and they can't make the stuff fast enough anyways. But it does lead the colonists to start to become more and more independent. In 1773, bowing to pressure from the British West Indian Planters Parliament, this being the British Parliament, passed the Molasses Act. This is one of the few things that we will talk about now that leads to the Revolutionary War. It was aimed at crushing North American trade with the French West Indies. Okay, it was a reminder. You have to buy your stuff from the British. You can't buy it from the French. And the colonists just began to smuggle it. And they were in the New England region. That also happens to be the region that is most in favor of declaring their independence from Great Britain. All right, that's as far as we will go today. We will finish the rest of the notes tomorrow.